December 27th, 1942. 10,000 feet over Buna, New Guinea. Captain Thomas Lynch pushed his twin-boomed P-38 Lightning into a near-vertical dive, watching a formation of Japanese dive bombers through his windscreen. His airspeed indicator climbed past 350 knots, 375, 400. The massive Allison engines screamed. Behind him, 3 other Lightning pilots, all flying their first combat mission in the new aircraft, struggled to follow his dive angle. The concentrated firepower of 4 50-caliber machine guns and 1 20mm cannon erupted from the P-38's nose. Tracers stitched across a Nakajima Oscar. The Japanese fighter disintegrated. Lynch kept diving, passing through the scattered enemy formation at over 420 knots, too fast for the Zero escorts to react. Then, instead of trying to turn with the remaining Japanese fighters, something every American pilot had been told would get them killed. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Lynch did something his wingmen had never seen in training manuals. He pulled back hard on the stick and pointed his aircraft almost straight up. The twin Allisons, each producing nearly 1,500 horsepower, converted his tremendous speed into altitude. In less than 20 seconds, Lynch had climbed from 8,000 feet back to 14,000, well above the Japanese formation. The Zeros that had turned to pursue him were still struggling to climb through 11,000 feet. Lynch rolled inverted, selected another target, and dove again. By the time his ammunition ran out, Lynch had destroyed 2 Japanese aircraft. His 3 wingmen, following his example, had claimed 5 more. Not a single P-38 was hit. The engagement lasted less than 4 minutes. When Lynch landed at Port Moresby and climbed from his cockpit, he just demonstrated the tactic that would transform American air combat across the Pacific. He hadn't turned with the Zeros. He hadn't tried to outmaneuver them horizontally. He'd used speed and altitude, attacking from above, diving through the enemy formation, then climbing back to altitude before they could respond. His squadron mates gathered around, asking how he'd done it. Lynch's explanation was simple. The P-38 couldn't turn with a Zero, everyone knew that, but it could dive faster than any Japanese fighter, and those twin turbocharged engines could outclimb anything in the sky when you had speed to convert into altitude. "Don't fight their fight," he told them. "Fight ours." The tactic would eventually be called zoom and boom, though pilots in 1943 simply described it as diving attacks followed by vertical escapes. What Lynch discovered that morning over Buna wasn't just a clever maneuver, it was the beginning of the end for Japanese air superiority in the Pacific. The problem started long before December 1942, when American pilots first encountered the Mitsubishi Ace-XM-0 in combat over the Philippines and Java. They quickly learned a brutal lesson. Traditional dogfighting tactics, the kind taught at every flight school in America, were suicide against this aircraft. The Zero could outturn virtually any fighter the United States had deployed. Its turning radius at combat speeds was roughly 400 feet tighter than a P-38 Warhawk and nearly 600 feet tighter than a P-38 Lightning. At altitudes below 20,000 feet, where most Pacific combat occurred, the Zero was queen of the horizontal turn. American pilots who tried to follow a Zero into a turning engagement found themselves on the outside of the circle, losing speed, becoming the target instead of the hunter. The mathematics were unforgiving. Turn radius depends on velocity and g-force loading. The Zero's lightweight construction gave it superior turn performance. It weighed just over 5,000 pounds fully loaded. A P-38 Lightning weighed over 17,000 pounds combat loaded. That weight difference translated directly into turning radius. When both aircraft pulled maximum sustainable g-forces in a horizontal turn, the Zero's circle was dramatically smaller. An American pilot trying to turn inside that circle was attempting a geometric impossibility. Early engagement reports from the 5th Air Force in Australia told a grim story. Squadrons flying P-39 Airacobras and P-38 Warhawks were taking heavy losses. Pilots who survived their first encounters with Zeros learned quickly. Don't turn. Don't try to fight them at low altitude. Use speed and dive away if you get in trouble. It was defensive doctrine, survival tactics for pilots flying inferior aircraft, but defensive tactics don't win air wars. By mid-1942, General George Kenney, commanding the 5th Air Force, was sending increasingly urgent messages to Washington. His pilots needed better aircraft. They needed something that could not just survive against Zeros but dominate them. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning looked like the answer. Twin Allison -50-17-10 engines, each with a turbo supercharger, giving the aircraft performance that seemed impossible. Maximum speed over 400 miles per hour, service ceiling of 40,000 feet, range exceeding 1,300 miles with drop tanks, and firepower that made everything else in the theater look modest. 4 50-caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon, all mounted in the nose, all firing straight ahead with no convergence issues. On paper, the P-38 was formidable. In early combat, it was nearly disastrous. The problem wasn't the aircraft's performance characteristics. The problem was doctrine. When the 39th Fighter Squadron became the first 5th Air Force unit to receive P-38 Sekunde in October 1942, most of their pilots had been flying P-39 era Cobras. They'd learned to survive against Zeros by avoiding prolonged engagements, using hit-and-run tactics, never getting trapped in a turning fight. The P-38 gave them more power, more speed, more altitude capability, but the instinct to turn with the enemy, the fundamental reflex drilled into every fighter pilot since World War I, was hard to overcome. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, who survived the war with 64 confirmed victories, wrote about the P-38's combat debut. The strange lightnings made their appearance in the Solomon Islands during the fall of 1942. To the great delight of our pilots, the P-38 pilots would attempt to dogfight with the Zeros, which managed to shoot down many of the enemy fighters. Sakai's assessment was accurate. Early P-38 units were trying to fight Zeros using tactics that favored the Japanese aircraft. American pilots would see an enemy formation, dive to attack, and then, when Zeros turned to engage, they'd try to turn with them. The P-38's wide turning radius, necessary because of its weight and wing loading, made it vulnerable. Several Lightnings were shot down in November and early December by Zero pilots, who simply circled inside the American turn and achieved firing solutions. The 5th Air Force was getting a better aircraft, but they were using it wrong. Thomas Lynch understood this problem because he'd lived it. During his months flying P-39 Sekunde against Zeros, he'd learned the hard way that turning fights were death. On June 15, 1942, Lynch had been jumped by 6 Zeros while flying a P-39 over Buna. He'd managed to shake off the first 2, only to have 4 more attack from different angles. His aircraft took severe damage. Cannon shells punched through the P-39's thin armor, control surfaces were shredded, 1 engine cylinder was destroyed. Lynch had to bail out at 800 feet, breaking his arm as he exited the damaged cockpit. He survived, but the lesson was permanent. You couldn't outturn a Zero. Trying was how you died. When Lynch returned to duty and the 39th Fighter Squadron received their P-38 Sekunde, he approached the new aircraft with that experience burned into his thinking. The Lightning was faster than anything he'd flown. It could dive like a brick. Those turbocharged engines maintained power at altitudes where P-39 Sekunde and P-40 Sekunde wheezed and struggled, but it was heavy. Maneuvering at low speeds felt sluggish compared to the nimble P-39. Lynch started thinking about the P-38's strengths rather than trying to overcome its weaknesses. The aircraft excelled in the vertical dimension. It could climb faster than a Zero when it had excess speed. It could dive faster than any Japanese fighter without structural failure. What if, Lynch thought, you stopped trying to fight Zeros in horizontal turns and instead fought them vertically? The concept wasn't entirely new. American pilots had been using diving attacks since the beginning of the war. But they'd been diving into engagements, then trying to stay and dogfight. Lynch's innovation was simpler and more radical. Dive, shoot, keep diving, then climb back to altitude. Never stay at the enemy's level. Never give them a chance to use their turning advantage. Use the vertical dimension as both weapon and escape route. His first test came on December 27th. Leading a 4-plane flight, all P-38 Sekunde, Lynch spotted a formation of Japanese dive bombers escorted by Zeros approaching Buna. Instead of engaging at the bomber's altitude, Lynch climbed higher, positioning himself 5,000 feet above the enemy. When he rolled into his attack, he committed fully. The dive was steep, nearly 70 degrees. His airspeed built rapidly. At 400 knots, the P-38's controls were still responsive, still precise. Japanese fighters at that speed would experience severe control stiffening. Lynch fired a 2-second burst. The concentrated firepower from 5 weapons struck an Oscar. The Japanese fighter came apart. Lynch kept diving, passing through the enemy formation before the Zero escorts could react. Then came the crucial moment. Every instinct said to pull out of the dive, level off, engage the enemy. Lynch ignored that instinct. He kept his speed, pulled back gently on the stick, and converted his velocity into altitude. The twin Allisons roared at full power. The P-38 climbed at over 4,000 feet per minute. 15 seconds after bottoming out from his dive, Lynch was back at 12,000 feet. The Zeros were still struggling to organize a defense at 8,000. He had altitude advantage again. He could dive again. The enemy couldn't touch him. His wingmen, watching Lynch's attack, followed his example. They dove, fired, kept diving, then climbed back up. The Japanese formation scattered. Within 4 minutes, American pilots had claimed 7 enemy aircraft without taking a single hit. Lynch landed and immediately began explaining the tactic to other pilots in the squadron. The physics were straightforward, he told them. The P-38 could dive at speeds the Zero couldn't match. Those turbocharged engines maintained power at altitude, allowing rapid climbs that Zero pilots couldn't counter. You started high, dove fast, shot, while passing through the enemy formation, kept your speed, then climbed back to altitude. You never fought at the enemy's preferred altitude. You never gave them a horizontal turning fight. You used the vertical dimension, which was the one place the P-38's weight and power gave it overwhelming advantage. Not everyone believed him at first. The tactic seemed counterintuitive. Decades of fighter doctrine emphasized turning performance, sustained combat, staying engaged with the enemy. Lynch was saying the opposite. Hit them once and leave. Climb back up, hit them again, never stay and fight where they're strong. But the results were undeniable. Within 2 weeks, the 39th Fighter Squadron was consistently destroying Japanese aircraft at ratios that seemed impossible, 5-1, 7-1. Missions where every P-38 returned undamaged, while Japanese formations were decimated. By January 1943, other squadrons were asking how the 39th was achieving such success. Lynch's tactic began spreading through the 5th Air Force, pilot to pilot, flight leader to flight leader. It remained largely unofficial. Training manuals still emphasized traditional dogfighting techniques. But in the combat squadrons operating out of Port Moresby and Dobodura, a new doctrine was taking shape. The P-38's true power wasn't in turning, it was in the vertical attack. The Allison the 5th 17-ton engine was the critical component that made zoom and boom tactics possible. Unlike many aircraft engines of the period, which lost power progressively with altitude, the P-38's engines were equipped with General Electric turbo superchargers. This technology allowed the engines to maintain sea-level power output up to approximately 25,000 feet. The implications were enormous. A Zero pilot at 15,000 feet was operating with an engine producing perhaps 70% of its sea-level horsepower. A P-38 pilot at the same altitude had nearly full power available. When both aircraft attempted to climb, the difference was dramatic. The P-38 could sustain a climb rate of over 3,000 feet per minute at altitudes where the Zero struggled to manage 1,500. This power advantage meant that Lynch's tactic wasn't just clever, it was backed by engineering reality. Each P-38 carried 2 of these turbocharged engines, giving a total of approximately 3,000 horsepower at combat settings. That massive power output, combined with the aircraft's relatively clean aerodynamics, produced a combination of speed and climb performance that Japanese fighters simply couldn't match. The aircraft could accelerate to over 420 knots in a dive, speeds where Zero pilots reported severe control stiffening and structural concerns. The P-38's airframe was deliberately overbuilt. Lockheed engineers had designed the aircraft to handle positive G-loads up to 7.5 Gs. In practical terms, this meant a pilot could pull out of a steep dive at high speeds without fear of wing failure. Japanese fighters, particularly the Zero with its lightweight construction optimized for maneuverability, had structural limits closer to 5 or 6 Gs. Attempting to follow a P-38 through a full-power dive and pull-out risked catastrophic airframe failure. Several Japanese pilots died in early 1943 trying to match American dive tactics. Intelligence reports documented Zero wreckage, showing wing failures consistent with excessive G-loading during high-speed maneuvers. The nose-mounted armament configuration was another crucial advantage. Unlike wing-mounted guns that required convergence settings, the P-38's weapons all fired along the aircraft's centerline. A pilot aimed the entire aircraft, and every round went where he pointed. In a high-speed diving pass, when the target might be in view for less than 2 seconds, this concentration of fire was devastating. 4 50-caliber machine guns delivered approximately 3,000 rounds per minute combined. The 20mm cannon added another 650 rounds per minute. In a typical 2-second burst during a diving attack, a P-38 pilot fired approximately 100 heavy-caliber rounds directly at the target. Japanese aircraft, with their lightweight construction and minimal armor protection, couldn't withstand that concentration of firepower. A single well-aimed burst was usually enough to destroy any enemy fighter or bomber. Richard Bong, who would become America's highest-scoring ace with 40 victories, all achieved in P-38 Sekunda, flew his first combat missions with the 39th Fighter Squadron alongside Thomas Lynch. Bong watched Lynch demonstrate the zoom and boom tactic and immediately recognized its effectiveness. By January 1943, Bong was using the same vertical attack doctrine, refining it with his own variations. Bong's approach was even more aggressive than Lynch's. Where Lynch emphasized climbing back to altitude before making another pass, Bong sometimes made multiple diving attacks in quick succession, using his excess speed to zoom back up just enough to dive again. It was higher risk, offering less margin for error, but in Bong's hands it was devastatingly effective. On several occasions, Bong closed to such short range during diving attacks that he flew through the debris field of aircraft he'd just destroyed. His squadron mates reported watching Bong's P-38 emerge from clouds of wreckage, parts and fuel vapor streaming past his canopy. Once, Bong actually collided with a Japanese aircraft during a head-on pass, shearing off part of the enemy's wing with his own wingtip. The Zero spun away and crashed. Bong's P-38, built tough enough to absorb the impact, flew home with damaged but functional control surfaces. The victory was officially listed as probable, since Bong hadn't actually shot the aircraft down. What made Bong exceptionally dangerous was his willingness to attack from any angle, any altitude, against any odds. Where other pilots preferred diving attacks from above, Bong would sometimes attack from below, zooming up through enemy formations at full power, firing as he climbed, then continuing his climb to gain altitude advantage. Or he'd approach at the same altitude, build speed in level flight, and convert that speed into a sudden climb at the last moment, surprising Japanese pilots who expected diving attacks. But whether attacking from above or below, Bong always followed the fundamental principle Lynch had discovered. Use speed and vertical movement. Never stay at the enemy's altitude in a sustained fight. Never try to turn with them horizontally. Keep moving, keep climbing or diving. Use the P-38's power advantage to dictate every engagement parameter. By April 1943, Bong, had claimed 10 confirmed victories. By July, he'd reached 20. His aggressive tactics came with risk. Several times, Bong returned to base with his P-38 heavily damaged by return fire from Japanese aircraft he'd attacked at point-blank range. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Once, a Zero pilot managed to score hits on Bong's right engine during a head-on pass, forcing him to limp back to Port Moresby on one engine, something the P-38's twin-engine design made survivable. The zoom and boom doctrine transformed how P-38 squadrons approached combat missions. By March 1943, flight leaders across the 5th Air Force were briefing their pilots using the same principles Lynch and Bong had demonstrated. The standard tactical approach became formalized, though it remained largely unwritten in official documents. Fighter sweeps began with P-38 formations climbing to altitude before entering the combat area. 20,000 feet was common, 25,000 for missions where Japanese fighters were expected at high altitude. The formations maintained loose spacing, allowing each pilot room to maneuver. When enemy aircraft were spotted below, the lead element would position itself optimally, usually with the sun behind them to mask their approach. The attack began with a steep dive, typically 60 to 70 degrees. Pilots pushed their throttles forward, building speed toward 400 knots. The target might be a bomber formation, a group of fighters, or even individual aircraft caught in vulnerable positions. At approximately 1,000 feet above the target, pilots opened fire. The engagement window was brief, usually 2 to 3 seconds. Pilots fired, confirmed hits if possible, then kept diving, passing completely through the enemy formation. The dive continued until the pilot had built maximum practical speed, typically 420 to 450 knots. Then came the zoom. Stick back, aircraft nose pointed nearly vertical, twin Allisons at full power. P-38 converted its tremendous kinetic energy into potential energy, trading speed for altitude. A pilot who dived from 20,000 feet down to 8,000 feet, then zoomed back up, could often regain 15,000 feet or more before his speed bled off. The climb took between 20 and 30 seconds. During that time, Japanese fighters at the lower altitude couldn't effectively pursue. Their engines lacked the power to match the P-38's climb rate, especially when the American aircraft still had substantial airspeed from the dive. By the time the P-38 pilot leveled off and assessed the situation, he was back above the enemy, ready to dive again if targets remained. The tactic's effectiveness multiplied when entire squadrons adopted it. Individual diving attacks were dangerous for the attacker. A lone P-38 diving through an enemy formation drew concentrated fire from multiple defenders. But when 4, 6, or 8 P-38 Sekunde dove in succession, each separated by a few seconds, the defensive challenge for Japanese pilots became overwhelming. The first lightning would strike, scattering the formation. Before the Japanese pilots could reorganize, the second P-38 was already firing. Then the third. By the 4th or 5th attack, enemy formations had completely lost cohesion. Pilots were focused on individual survival rather than mutual defense. Wingmen became separated from their leaders. The tight formations that made Japanese air combat doctrine effective simply disintegrated under repeated vertical attacks. Squadron commanders discovered that 4-plane flights were optimal for zoom and boom tactics. The flight leader would attack first, drawing attention and disrupting the enemy formation. His wingman would attack seconds later from a slightly different angle. The second element, flying slightly behind and offset, would time their attacks to hit the scattered enemy pilots who'd turned to defend against the first element. It was systematic destruction, turning air combat from a swirling melee into something that resembled an industrial process. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea, in early March 1943, demonstrated the zoom and boom doctrine at maximum scale. Japanese forces were attempting to reinforce their garrison at Leh with a convoy of 8 transport ships and 8 destroyers, escorted by approximately 30 Zero fighters. American intelligence detected the convoy, and General Kenny ordered an all-out attack. Over 200 bombers and fighters were committed. P-38 Sekunde from multiple squadrons, including the 39th and 9th Fighter Squadrons, provided top cover and fighter sweep operations. Thomas Lynch led elements of the 39th into battle over the convoy on March 3rd. His P-38 Sekunde climbed to 22,000 feet, well above the Zero escorts that were flying combat air patrol over the vulnerable ships below. Lynch's attack came from directly out of the sun. The diving P-38 Sekunde weren't visible to the Japanese pilots until they were already firing. The first pass destroyed 3 Zeros and damaged 2 more. Lynch and his pilots zoomed back to altitude, reformed briefly, then dove again. The Zero pilots attempted to climb and intercept the Americans, but by the time they reached 18,000 feet, the P-38 Sekunde had already completed their second pass and were climbing back to 23,000. The engagement lasted nearly 40 minutes. Lynch's squadron made 5 separate diving attacks. Each time, they destroyed or damaged Japanese aircraft without taking losses. By the end of the battle, the 39th claimed 12 Zero fighters destroyed. The entire 5th Air Force claimed between 15 and 20 enemy aircraft shot down that day. More importantly, without effective fighter protection, the Japanese convoy was destroyed by American and Australian bombers. All 8 transports and 4 destroyers were sunk. Nearly 3,000 Japanese soldiers died. The Americans lost 4 aircraft total in the Tanote and battle, none of them P-38 Sekunde in air-to-air combat. The kill ratios were staggering. For the P-38 squadrons employing Lynch's tactics, the exchanges were approaching 10-1 or better. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was profound and immediate. For more than a year, from December 1941 through late 1942, Zero pilots had dominated the Pacific Air War. They'd been confident, aggressive, masters of their craft. American pilots had been the ones running, surviving, using desperate defensive tactics. Now the dynamic was reversing. Japanese pilots in early 1943 began reporting encounters where American P-38 Sekunde would appear from above, attack with devastating firepower, then vanish back into the sky before the Japanese pilots could respond. Zero pilots would turn to engage, only to find empty air. By the time they looked up again, the P-38 Sekunde were thousands of feet above them, preparing to dive again. Captured documents and post-war interviews revealed the frustration. Japanese pilots knew the Zero was more maneuverable. They knew their aircraft could turn tighter circles. But that advantage was becoming irrelevant. The Americans weren't fighting in circles anymore. They were attacking from the vertical dimension, using speed and altitude, never staying in one place long enough to be caught. One Japanese pilot, interviewed after being captured in May 1943, described the experience. "We could see them above us. We knew they would dive, but when they came, the speed was so great we could not track them. We would turn to pursue, but they were already gone, climbing back to altitude. It was like fighting ghosts. We could not catch them, could not force them to fight our way." The tactical helplessness was devastating to morale. Japanese naval aviation had been built on a doctrine of superior individual pilot skill and aircraft maneuverability. Aces like Saburo Sakai and Hiroyoshi Nishizawa had achieved their victories through masterful dogfighting, exploiting the Zero's turning ability to defeat less skilled opponents. Against American pilots using zoom and boom tactics, those skills were nearly useless. You can't outturn an aircraft that refuses to turn. By mid-1943, Japanese training programs were attempting to develop counter-tactics. Instructors taught pilots to maintain constant vigilance above their formations, to never assume the sky above was clear. Fighter escorts were ordered to fly combat air patrol at staggered altitudes, with some elements positioned high to intercept diving attackers. The problem was that maintaining altitude advantage required fuel and time. Japanese fighters had excellent range for their size, but maintaining high altitude for extended periods consumed fuel rapidly. And even when Japanese fighters positioned themselves at high altitude, the P-38 could simply climb higher. The turbocharged engines that gave Lightnings their advantage at 15,000 feet worked just as well at 25,000 or 30,000 feet. More fundamentally, the counter-tactics required Japanese pilots to fight defensively, to be reactive rather than aggressive. This violated their entire doctrinal approach to air combat. Pilots trained to attack, to seek engagement, to trust their aircraft's maneuverability, were now being told to fly defensively, to watch the sky above, to avoid engagement unless conditions were perfect. The psychological shift was profound and damaging. April 18, 1943. The operation that would cement the P-38's reputation and demonstrate the zoom and boom doctrine's strategic value began before dawn at Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. American intelligence had intercepted and decoded Japanese communications, revealing that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and commander of the Imperial Japanese Navy, would be conducting an inspection tour of forward bases in the Taifa, Solomon Islands. Yamamoto's schedule had been transmitted in code that American cryptanalysts had broken. The Admiral would be flying in a Mitsubishi Betty bomber, escorted by 6 Zeros, departing Rabaul at 6 in the morning and arriving at Balala Airfield on Bougainville at approximately 9:35 local time. The route, altitude and timing were all specified in the intercepted messages. 16 P-38 pilots were selected for the mission. The target was over 430 miles from Henderson Field, near the maximum combat radius of the Lightning. The mission profile required flying at extremely low altitude, between 10 and 50 feet above the ocean, to avoid Japanese radar detection. Navigation would be critical. There were no landmarks over open ocean, and the pilots would need to intercept Yamamoto's flight at precisely the right time and location. Major John Mitchell led the mission. Thomas Lynch flew as one of the attack element leaders. Richard Bong was initially selected, but had to withdraw due to a maintenance issue with his aircraft. The 16 P-38 launched at 7:25 in the morning, skimming across the ocean surface, maintaining radio silence. They flew for over 2 hours at wave-top height, pilots manually flying the entire route, unable to use autopilot at such low altitude. At approximately 9:34, the P-38 climbed to intercept altitude. Lieutenant Doug Canning spotted the Betty bombers and their Zero escort almost immediately. 2 Betty bombers, flying at about 4,500 feet, with 6 Zeros in formation above them at approximately 6,500 feet. The American formation split. 4 P-38, including Lynch, went after the bombers. The remaining 12 engaged the Zero escorts to prevent them from interfering. Lynch dove on the lead Betty, the aircraft carrying Admiral Yamamoto. His closure speed exceeded 400 knots. The concentrated firepower from his P-38 struck the Betty's right engine and wing root. The bomber caught fire. Lynch's wingman, Lieutenant Rex Barber, fired on the same aircraft from a different angle. The Betty attempted evasive maneuvers, diving toward the jungle canopy. Lynch and Barber both claimed hits on the Admiral's aircraft as it descended, trailing heavy smoke. The Betty crashed into the jungle near Buin. Admiral Yamamoto was killed on impact. His body would be found by Japanese search parties the following day. The second Betty, carrying Yamamoto's chief of staff, was attacked by Lieutenant Besby Holmes and crashed into the ocean. The Zero escorts attempted to defend their charges, but the remaining P-38 employed the zoom and boom tactics that had become standard doctrine. They engaged the Zeros at high speed, fired, then dove away toward the ocean before the Japanese pilots could turn to respond. 1 P-38 was lost in the engagement, shot down by Zeros. 1 other P-38 was damaged but made it back to Henderson Field. The mission succeeded brilliantly. Admiral Yamamoto, the most respected and capable commander in the Japanese Navy, was dead. The psychological impact on Japanese military and civilian morale was devastating. Emperor Hirohito was informed. A state funeral was held. The loss was considered so damaging that Japanese leadership delayed announcing Yamamoto's death for over a month, fearing the effect on public morale. For the P-38 pilots, the mission demonstrated that zoom and boom tactics worked not just in conventional combat, but in long-range precision strike operations. They'd flown over 400 miles at low altitude, climbed to intercept enemy aircraft at a precise time and location, executed diving attacks against heavily defended targets, and returned home. The tactic that Thomas Lynch had discovered over Buna 4 months earlier had just changed the strategic balance in the Pacific. By summer 1943, zoom and boom had become formalized doctrine across 5th Air Force, P-38 squadrons. Training, programs for replacement pilots included explicit instruction in vertical attack tactics. New pilots arriving in theater were taught before their first combat mission. Start high. Dive fast. Shoot. Keep diving. Zoom back to altitude. Never turn with the enemy unless absolutely necessary for survival. The tactic's success created a feedback loop that accelerated Japanese losses. As American pilots became more proficient in zoom and boom attacks, Japanese losses increased. As losses increased, experienced Japanese pilots died or were rotated back to Japan, replaced by less experienced aviators with abbreviated training. These replacement pilots were even less capable of countering vertical attack tactics, leading to more losses, perpetuating the cycle. By late 1943, new Japanese pilots arriving in the Southwest Pacific had, on average, less than half the flight hours of the American pilots they faced. Some had as little as 100 hours of total flight time before entering combat. These pilots were taught traditional dogfighting tactics, turn and burn, use the Zero's maneuverability. They had no effective training for countering high-speed diving attacks. The result was predictable. American kill ratios continued climbing, 10-1, 15-1. In some engagements, 20-1 or higher. P-38 squadrons would return from missions having destroyed a dozen or more Japanese aircraft without losses. The 5th Air Force achieved air superiority over New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, not through superior numbers, but through superior tactics, exploiting superior aircraft performance characteristics. Charles MacDonald, who would eventually achieve 27 confirmed victories, all in P-38 Secunda, described the psychological advantage American pilots gained from zoom and boom tactics. We knew we could attack whenever we wanted. We knew we could break off and escape whenever we chose. The Japanese pilots didn't have that control. They had to react to us. They were always defensive, always waiting for us to attack from above. That uncertainty, that lack of control, it destroyed their effectiveness even before we fired a shot. The doctrine spread beyond the 5th Air Force validated its effectiveness. Marine Corps and Navy pilots, initially skeptical of Army Air Force tactics, began adopting similar vertical attack doctrines when flying Fear-U Corsairs and F-6F Hellcats. The aircraft were different, the specific performance parameters varied, but the fundamental principle remained consistent. Use speed and altitude. Attack from above. Don't turn with more maneuverable opponents. Fight in the vertical dimension where American aircraft design gave overwhelming advantage. By 1944, the tactical transformation was complete. American pilots across the Pacific routinely employed zoom and boom tactics against Japanese aircraft. The kill ratios reflected this dominance. Over the course of the war, P-38 pilots in the Pacific theater would be credited with destroying over 1,800 Japanese aircraft. 7 of the top 10 American aces in the Pacific flew P-38 Secunda. Every one of them used zoom and boom tactics as their primary combat doctrine. Richard Bong finished the war with 40 confirmed victories, America's highest-scoring ace. Thomas McGuire, flying P-38 Secunda with the 475th Fighter Group, achieved 38 victories. Charles MacDonald scored 27. Gerald Johnson achieved 22. All of them attributed their success to the same tactical approach Thomas Lynch had demonstrated on December 27, 1942. Attack from altitude, dive through the enemy, zoom back to altitude, repeat. The tactic's legacy extended far beyond World War II. When the Korean War began in 1950, American pilots facing Soviet-built MiG-15 fighters encountered a familiar problem. The MiG could outturn American F-86 Sabres in horizontal combat. American pilots, many of them World War II veterans, applied the lessons learned over the Pacific. They fought vertically, using diving attacks and zoom climbs, exploiting the F-86's superior roll rate and dive performance. The establishment of the Navy Fighter Weapons School, Top Gun, in 1969 codified these principles into formal doctrine. Instructors taught energy management, vertical maneuvers, and the fundamental rule that had been discovered over New Guinea 26 years earlier. Never fight the enemy's fight. Use your aircraft strengths. Control the engagement parameters. Modern fighter tactics, whether in F-16 Sekunde, F-18 Sekunde, or F-35 Sekunde, still incorporate these principles. Energy management, the concept of trading altitude for speed and speed for altitude, traces directly to zoom and boom doctrine. The emphasis on maintaining energy advantage, on controlling engagement, ranges and angles, on using vertical separation to dictate combat timing. All of this comes from lessons learned by P-38 pilots fighting Zeros over the Pacific. Thomas Lynch didn't survive the war. On March 8, 1944, Lynch and Richard Bong were strafing Japanese barges in Itape Harbor. After their first pass set one barge on fire, they returned for a second attack. Ground fire struck Lynch's P-38 Zoll, the right engine. The aircraft caught fire. Lynch struggled to gain altitude, fighting for enough height to bail out safely. His P-38 climbed to approximately 800 feet before the fire became uncontrollable. Bong, flying alongside, radioed desperately for Lynch to bail out. Lynch ejected, but 800 feet wasn't enough altitude for his parachute to fully deploy. Bong watched his mentor and friend fall into the jungle. Lynch's body was never recovered. He was 27 years old, credited with 20 confirmed victories, one of the most skilled and tactically innovative pilots in the Pacific theater. Richard Bong continued flying combat missions until December 1944, when General Kenny finally ordered him home after he'd achieved 40 victories. Kenny believed Bong had contributed more than his share to the war effort and needed to survive to serve as an example for future pilots. Bong returned to the United States, married his girlfriend Marjorie Vattendahl in February 1945, and became a test pilot for Lockheed. On August 6, 1945, the same day the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, Bong was killed testing a P-38 Shooting Star jet fighter. The aircraft's fuel pump failed shortly after takeoff. Bong ejected, but he was too close to the ground. His parachute never fully opened. America's ace of aces was dead at age 24, just months after the war he'd dominated had ended. The P-38 Lightning flew its last combat missions in August 1945. Over 10,000 Lightnings were built during the war. They flew over 130,000 combat missions across every theater. In the Pacific, where the aircraft found its ideal employment, P-38 Sekunde achieved kill ratios that exceeded any other American fighter. But the aircraft's true legacy wasn't in production numbers or even kill ratios. It was in demonstrating that tactical innovation could be as important as engineering superiority. The P-38's physical characteristics, its speed, its climb rate, its concentrated firepower, mattered only because pilots like Thomas Lynch and Richard Bong figured out how to use those characteristics properly. The zoom and boom doctrine transformed the P-38 from an aircraft with advantages into a weapon system that dominated its opponents. That transformation didn't come from Lockheed's engineers or Army Air Force tactical planners. It came from combat pilots, flying desperate missions over hostile jungles, discovering under fire that their aircraft's weight and power could become advantages rather than limitations if they stopped trying to fight like their enemies and started fighting like themselves. The lesson was simple, profound, and permanent. Don't turn with Zeros. Dive through them. Zoom back to altitude. Attack on your terms, using your strengths, controlling the engagement. The physics were undeniable. The results were overwhelming. and the doctrine became the foundation for how America would train fighter pilots for the next 8 decades. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.